Good day, everyone! It's Londononion back with another discussion on archetype builds. Continuing from our last discussion, our focus today will be with the Hunter archetype. Just like our previous videos, builds will be constructed with the orientation of being a solo artist. As usual, I'll be speaking on the efficacy of archetype pairings with the assumption of playing on the Apocalypse difficulty. My general philosophy being that what works on higher difficulties will usually work on lower ones, and with greater leeway / room for user error. There is still plenty for me to discover in Remnant 2, and consequently I may likely revisit this archetype and the proposed pairings in the future. Going hand in hand with this understanding, critical discussions / queries are welcome on this channel, so feel free to share your ideas and or disagreements. In our last video, we had discussed the Dead to Rights Painbringer, or Hunter and Summoner. Today, we'll be discussing the Dead to Rights Sharpshooter. The Dead to Rights Sharpshooter has the Gunslinger as the secondary archetype. For simplicity, we'll refer to this pairing as the Sharpshooter for the duration of this discussion. The Gunslinger is oriented toward high-interval round expenditure, seamless reloading, and has an edge toward ammo conservation and production. Now, when speaking on the Hunter archetype in our last video, one of the areas of improvement for the Hunter was dealing with overwhelming enemy pressure, especially at close range. To be fair, weapon selection may affect one's efficacy in such circumstances, but as this onion had reasoned, the Hunter is better off with low fire rate and high damage weapons while eliminating enemies from a distance. An inevitable occurrence is of course dealing with enemies for close quarters combat. The Gunslinger is intended to be a direct answer to this. The Hunter and the Gunslinger, as far as I've been able to notice, are the leading archetypes in DPS, and I would go as far as to say that they are two sides to the same coin. The Hunter is predisposed to a defensive, tactical, and impactful method of taking on foes. Conversely, the Gunslinger is more offensive, dynamic, and progressively destructive. Think decapitation versus death by 1,000 cuts. The Hunter and the Gunslinger are a compensatory pairing in their meta of enemy engagement and synergistic in their skills and perks. Where the Hunter is buffed in ranged and weak spot damage, the Gunslinger adds the buffs of increased reload speed and fire rate. This creates greater performance in semi-automatic and single-round magazine weapons. This will also allow easier activation of the Hunter Prime perk, Dead to Rights, which helps to extend the duration of their skills. This advantage is especially important given the suggested weapon loadout for the Hunter. Faster ammo expenditure can be a disadvantage, but the Gunslinger archetype trait, Ammo Reserves, acts as a counterbalance with 50% increased ammo reserves. Plus, with the Hunter archetype trait, Long Shot, there is more room for user error. This is also supplemented with Return to Sender and Posse Up. Regardless of how one chooses to eliminate their enemies, there is a low likelihood ammo will be an issue. Urgency adds to the dynamic predisposition of the Gunslinger with increased movement speed following enemy elimination, and synergizes with Quick Hands for augmented reload speed for anywhere from 25 to 35% without skills involved. But before we can speak on skills, we'll first discuss the weapon loadout. Now, just as the Hunter and Gunslinger are two sides of the same coin, so to speak, their ideal weapon profiles will also follow suit and can ironically breed some level of incompatibility. Both have valid ways of eliminating foes, but since we are dealing with the Hunter as the prime, I choose to prioritize their ideal weapon profile first, with a secondary consideration for the Gunslinger side. The primary weapon I choose for this pairing is the Crescent Moon Longbow. From a base perspective, compared to other bows, it is nothing special. Its strength lies in its mod ability. Moonlight Barrage empowers one's arrows to apply moonlit to enemies upon a successful shot. Following a connected round, enemies will release a Moon Essence, which will return one arrow, heal 5% of one's max health, and grant 15% increased fire rate and reload speed for 5 seconds. All basic shots become automatically charged. Meanwhile, manually charged shots fire 2 arrows in blinding succession. To massively increase the efficacy of this weapon, I employ one of my favorite mutators, Sequence Shot, which will reduce charge time of subsequent shots by a maximum of 90% for 3 seconds. Shooting consistent, perfectly charged shots takes some getting used to, but it becomes a brief squeeze and release of the trigger, and the shots will become second nature, making the Moonlight Crescent, or bows in general, far more threatening. Part of the maximized perk of this mutator is that each charged primary shot grants 1% increased range critical chance and caps at 20%. This will not only allow a faster dissemination of rounds, but the expenditure is essentially cut in half with connected shots. Additionally, the sequence shot critical stacks will go up twice as fast. The speed alone makes this weapon dangerous in the right hands. Add in Moonlight Barrage, the increased ranged and weak spot damage from the Hunter, and the nimble buffs from the Gunslinger, and this will allow one to pulverize their enemies, particularly elites and bosses. Even though one is using a bow, the intervals of fire are reasonably fast and only become faster with mod activation. For our secondary, I employ the MP60 for its nimble fire rate, especially for circumstances where the bow cannot maintain its pressure. For its mutator, I employ Bandit, which has a 30% chance of returning spent ammo to the magazine at max level. Part of its maximization is an increase in fire rate by 10% for 3 seconds following its activation. This duration can extend up to 10 seconds. Now, the MP60 already has a fast enough fire rate, and increasing it is nearly inconsequential in this onion's opinion. I mainly employ this mutator to extend the suppressing fire. Extender is a good alternative if maximized, since the reload speed will become even faster. But again, this is a minute difference in performance. The mod I use is Concussive Blast as a failsafe option in the event enemy pressure is too great, or this onion's accuracy is in the garbage and consequently allowing enemy advancement. An alternative secondary I enjoy is the Silverback model, with Tremor for its mod and Harmonizer as the mutator. Lastly, for our melee weapon, this really comes down to preference, since melee-based offensive measures will make up an insignificant minority of attack patterns. However, I value the Dreamcatcher and Labyrinth Staff for slowing down enemies and boosting mod power respectively. Now, to help this build and the weapon choices work, we will transition into our skills. So the skills for the Sharpshooter are varied on the Hunter side, but static for the Gunslinger. On the Hunter side, I employ Hunter's Mark, or Hunter's Shroud. For the Gunslinger, I go with Bulletstorm. As for the rationale, starting first with the Hunter's Mark, as a lone gunman, having an enhanced view of a given battlefield allows a more tactical means of engaging with enemies, such as the sequence of which to take them on, or determining the level of firepower based on enemy volume. However, the main method of issuing out the most significant damage is with the Moonlight Crescent mod. But the mod only lasts 15 seconds, and sometimes it is hard to judge whether its use is warranted for either taking tough enemies down, eliminating a given mob efficiently, health regeneration, or all three. Hunter's Mark ultimately helps to inform this decision. Not to mention, without the help of summons, there is only an advantage in knowing the location of enemy presence. As for Hunter's Shroud, this has a similar proactive use to Hunter's Mark, but a somewhat different application. Outside of reducing enemy awareness and scouting unknown areas, Hunter's Shroud has the additional bonus of increasing damage upon exiting Shroud, aka Ambush, for 2 seconds with tapering damage. This will throw off enemy fire and allow a slight tactical advantage of repositioning with reduced pressure. In other words, stick and move. The intervals of returning to Shroud are fitting for the bow, and the 2 automatic shots with Moonlight Barrage will have a minimal difference in damage due to the speed of their interval. As for the Gunslinger skill, Bulletstorm increases fire rate by 20% and reload speed by 50%. Kills will instantly reload the wielded weapon, and bows gain 15% increased critical chance with a 50% increase in projectile speed. Starting first with the bow, mixed with Sequence Shot and Moonlight Barrage, Shot intervals are increased even further to dangerous levels where elites and even aberrations can be taken down with increased efficiency, provided one's dexterity is on point. Bulletstorm also works in favor of the MP60, since kills instantly reload the weapon and Bandit extends its magazine with returned rounds. A mob of close-knit, weak to moderately tough enemies can be eliminated with minimal effort. Even if enemies are not consecutively eliminated with the reload perk, the reload speed is seamless anyway. Next, to help supplement this build, we will transition to the Amulet and Rings. Just like our discussion on the Dead to Rights Painbringer, we'll continue using the Whispering Marble Amulet, which grants 3 stacks of Bulwark and 3% increased damage for each stack. The Hunter does not come with any natural defenses, an area of improvement that the Hunter and the Gunslinger also share. Offense is the main defense of the Sharpshooter. However, I am a proponent for having a thick layer of accident forgiveness. Carrying on, our first ring is the Dried Clay Ring, which grants a stack of Bulwark and increases all damage by 60% of the total Bulwark damage reduction. With 4 stacks, this brings us to 22% damage reduction, and the Clay Ring will add a damage buff of 13.2%. In aggregate with Whispering Marble, this brings us to 25.2% increased damage. Next, I employ the Encrypted Ring, which regenerates 20% of one's max health over 10 seconds and maximizes up to 30 seconds following a mod activation. The main rationale behind this choice is to supplement the effects of Moonlight Barrage. Even though one can heal through Moonlit Essence, there is no guarantee the volume of enemies required for substantial healing will be present, though this may also be skill dependent. As we had discussed earlier with Hunter's Mark, one can make a more informed decision on when to activate the mod since they can anticipate enemy movement. Additionally, the ring is intended to be an alternative source of health regeneration even when using the mods on the secondary weapon. Next, I employ Braided Thorns. After killing an enemy, one gains 15% increased critical chance for 10 seconds. Now this one may sound like a strange selection, but the rationale is naturally to add on to the critical chance of our other sources. Deadeye from the Hunter, Hunter's Mark or Hunter's Shroud, Swift Shot from the Gunslinger, and Bulletstorm grant a 40% increase in critical chance altogether. Add in Braided Thorns and this will jump up to 55%. Sequence Shot can add anywhere from 1 to 20% depending on ammo expenditure. Now this is all with maximum potential and for a limited window. One is more likely to be hovering around 25 to 40% with one skill activation and or an enemy eliminated. Giving a more logical take, I would posit that with this pairing, weak spot damage to the Hunter is like critical chance to the Gunslinger. What I mean by this is that the Gunslinger is about speed, but not necessarily precision. Their increased ammo expenditure would only imply that critical chances are in their favor, without the added stress of weak spot targeting. The Hunter is the inverse. They expend less ammo, but for greater impact. They are oriented toward precision and not necessarily speed, and this would encourage weak spot targeting. Either orientation, however, cannot be a sole reliance. Some enemies don't have weak spots or easily accessible weak spots, and critical damage can supplement for this. Other enemies, however, have easily accessible weak spots, and it would be a squander not to take advantage of this. And obviously, the healthy middle is a critical weak spot hit. The main idea behind employing Braided Thorns is that no matter the enemy being engaged, they will be subject to augmented damage. The Sharpshooter serves both sides, but amalgamates them to become a viable threat under all circumstances. Now the last ring is where some nuance can take place. I either employ Low Yield Recovery Ring, Dull Steel Ring, or Faerun Sigil. The choice between these rings is skill dependent. If using Hunter's Shroud, I prefer to use Low Yield Recovery or Dull Steel Ring as an added layer of self-preservation, since there will be less of a proactive use of the Moonlight Barrage. Low Yield Recovery replenishes 6% of one's health over 6 seconds for every enemy eliminated, and this maxes out at 30 seconds. Dull Steel Ring lowers one's dodge weight bracket by 1. This will essentially allow one to don heavier armor for increased damage reduction without suffering the penalties of heavy encumbrance. If using Hunter's Mark, I employ Faerun's Sigil, which allows critical and weak spot hits to generate 10% additional mod power and can work in direct favor of employing or building up towards Moonlight Barrage. To top off this build, we'll briefly speak on armor, relics, and traits. Armor is not a major fixation with this build, unless employing Dull Steel Ring. Typically, I would maximize armor as much as possible while in the medium encumbrance bracket. With Dull Steel Ring, the same idea applies for the heavy bracket. As for the relic, I personally favor the Ripened Heart for the amount it heals and its efficiency. Resonating Heart is also a viable option. The shards I employ are critical chance, critical damage, and heightened ammo reserves. The traits I employ are Vigor, Endurance, Spirit, Expertise, Footwork, Handling, Barkskin, Recovery, and Fitness. Now, throughout this discussion, I had a fixation on the Moonlight Crescent mod. The main reason for this is that the mod is a major part of self-preservation and putting down debilitating damage. For those that are familiar with my philosophy on constructing builds, you can't lose if you don't die. Naturally, capitalizing on the strength of the sharpshooter is key, but this onion is also a proponent of contingency. Now I can bet that there are a multitude of ways of constructing these archetypes to increase their damage per second while maintaining their self-preservation, in which case it would be nice to hear from the rest of you regarding these two Kings of Carnage from the perspective of the Hunter as the Prime. Otherwise, that concludes our build for today. We will be returning with more discussions on the Hunter and alternative secondary archetypes. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.